Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Waypoint, Parasha Tazria. An interesting parasha, and depending on the year, this parasha will be paired with next week's as well, Metzora. And so on non-leap years, these two will be squished together into a single Torah portion, so to speak. But they are two separate Torah portions. So depending on what the year is you're watching this video, you're either watching two videos this week or just one video this week. But that being said, let's go ahead and move forward with our brief introduction before I pass it off to Bradley for the primary lesson that he has prepared for you today. So once again, relatively simple, kind of short, partially why it's paired with a second portion on non-leap years. But we start off by talking about the laws of Nida, or the menstruation laws. There is a lot to be said here about the laws surrounding Nida. In fact, me and Brad have spent an entire evening, I think it's a 2.5 hour long discussion board talking about all of the various laws and things involved with the Nida, the family purity specifically is usually how it's known for the menstruation. If you want access to that talk, actually, that is a very sensitive topic, and we've reserved it to all of our supporters. So if you support us through the website or on the Patreon, you have access to that. And if you are not a supporter, you do not have access to that. But if you would like to become a supporter, think about joining the Patreon, support the ministry. That is one of the video topics, as well as many other exclusives that we have to supporters, where we go a little bit more in depth with topics such as the laws of Nida. Moving on from there, starting in chapter 13, now we have a shift in topic. It's not different from Nida, though. There's an interesting correlation between Nida, and the uncleanliness that comes with Nida, and the uncleanliness that comes with Tzara'at, which is commonly translated as leprosy, but it's not leprosy. The biblical leprosy is very different from the clinical leprosy that we see, in today's idea of the word leprosy. This kind of leprosy in the Bible can infect people, but also houses, cloth, leathers, different things, and it seems to be a very different type of sickness. And there are various ritual laws that come with this type of uncleanliness, and by and large, persons who have Sara'at are essentially considered a walking corpse. But anyway, Brad has a peculiar lesson prepared for you today on one of the weird aspects surrounding Sara'at. And that about wraps it up for us in this week's portion before we get into Parasha Metzora. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to my colleague Brad for the lesson he has prepared for you. Thank you once again for joining us, and I'll see you on the other side.
Hello, and allow me to personally welcome you to this week's Waypoint podcast. As Seamus said, this is an interesting parsha this week. The way it begins concerning the laws of Nida, and then kind of segues into the subject of Sara'at, right? Leprosy. And as Seamus mentioned, this is not leprosy as we know it. It's not Hansen's disease. That's the clinical leprosy that we know today. And interestingly enough, this is actually one of the atheists' biggest qualms with the biblical text, right? Is that we read about leprosy in the Old Testament, and what we know as leprosy today is not that old. At least we can't confirm that it existed prior to the medieval period. So that's one of the contentions that a lot of atheists take with the texts of Scripture, is this idea that a disease that we can't confirm existed until the medieval period existed some 1,000 or so years prior to the medieval period. But that's an important aspect here, is that biblical leprosy is not the same as Hansen's disease. And even the reasons that one might come by biblical leprosy is different, right? Biblical leprosy isn't even necessarily a medical condition. This is not something that can be healed medicinally. This is why a lot of the process concerning leprosy requires one to go to the priest and be inspected by the priest, and there's a lot of temple process involved with leprosy, especially regarding when one is clean of leprosy, or when one is just considered clean. And that's what I want to get to here, is between verses 12 and 15 of chapter 13 here in Leviticus. Okay, I'm going to restart that. Between chapter... Fuck. All right. Between verses 12 and 15 of chapter 13 here in Leviticus, we read an interesting bit about a person being completely covered with this tzara'at and then being declared clean. It seems rather weird, the idea that if they have a little bit of tzara'at, then now they're unclean, and if that tzara'at grows and expands on their body to the point that it covers it totally, now they're considered clean. But when we continue reading, if they begin to heal, you could say, or if normal skin begins to appear at this point, now they're unclean again. So why is this? Why is it that when somebody is totally corrupted, you could say, in this aspect, maybe that's too strong of a word to use, but they're totally covered in this condition that is making them unclean, now they're considered clean. But when they're in remission, now they're considered unclean again. It's very strange. And to go back to the word corruption, I think that has a lot to do with it. You see, if they're totally covered in it, there is no more of them that can be corrupted, right? It's beyond the point at which it can grow anymore. It's reached a completing point, a stopping point. So there's nothing else about this person that can be corrupted at this point. Whereas when they begin to come into remission, right, when normal skin begins to appear, well, that normal skin can still be corrupted again at that point. It may revert again, and so now they're unclean again. This, I think, teaches us a pretty interesting lesson about self-examination in our own lives. Not necessarily in terms of corruption, but maybe in terms of when you think that you've fallen to the lowest possible point. And this may be a very generic, very old way of viewing things, but when you've hit rock bottom, there's no way to go but up. So this would put you in more of a positive position. You can't really fall any further than rock bottom. And I think that in a way that's actually something that we can draw from this, because we've gone over before, I think, in at least minor detail, the condition of tzara'at. I know that some of you were in the watch party where we were watching the Mashiach Cafe video by Chabad, where the condition of tzara'at was being described in such a way as it pertains to Mashiach and how he would be considered the leper of the house of Rebbe. So in that video by Chabad, what's discussed is a number of different things, but how leprosy represents a type of almost deficiency in a person, but a deficiency in a person that's just shy of being perfect. Now, before you take what I just said incorrectly, I would highly recommend that you go and watch this video from Chabad called Mashiach the Leper, because that statement has to be viewed within its context. Understand, we don't really see people get biblical leprosy today. It's not something that happens today, which is interesting because, the rabbi even says, we tend to think of this like, oh, they must have been huge sinners back then because they got leprosy. And it's like, well, that's not really how that works. The reality is that today we don't get it more or less because we're not good enough, right? It's a condition that we don't rate at this point. Uh, the idea that the deficiency was something that would be almost surface deep in this person. So it's something that's like there but not there. It's they just had one hurdle to climb, and this is again has to be viewed within the context that he's speaking, but this I think helps to kind of frame this idea again to go back to this notion of hitting rock bottom, uh, to frame us in such a way that when we've hit rock bottom, it's generally very sobering. It's a point where we do have to self-reflect at this point, and you see how completely corrupted you have become, and that's the point at which you either make the decision to stay there or to begin to climb up, and climbing up may be a difficult process. And the climb here, or the remission of the leprosy, so to speak, puts you at risk, right? Because the higher you climb, the farther you can fall again. Just like in this case, somebody who is in remission from this leprosy is now unclean until they are completely healed of this condition, until there's no more of this tzara'at left on them. Then they can be welcomed back into the community, and it's almost the welcoming back into the community, as we'll read on and find later in the Torah, is treated very similarly to the birth of a new child in terms of offerings offered at the temple and whatnot. It's a reintroduction of this person new into the community, and that I think speaks to what I've been kind of dancing around, which is the idea of remaking the self, right? And that's ultimately what the opportunity is of hitting rock bottom, is to rebuild ourselves, to climb out of that pit and become a new creation, to become a new person, to be reintroduced to this world of Hashem's people in such a way that we aren't who we were before, right? Because we've overcome that hurdle, and I think that that's something that we can all take into not just the week, but the rest of our lives. And anyway, that's kind of what I got this week from the peculiarity of being considered clean when you're completely covered in sara'at, and then being considered unclean when you are in remission, at least until you are totally healed. So with that said, I will turn it over to my colleague Seamus for his final thoughts. Thank you.
All right, and now for my closing thoughts. I actually want to stick into this Torah portion for my closing thoughts. Normally we kind of tie in with the Haftarah or something, but I actually want to, because this Torah portion is so often tied together with the next Torah portion, kind of get the ball rolling for the next Torah portion as we talk about tzara'at. Now, again, this portion opens up with nida, which if you really look into the Hebrew, what you're dealing with is a type of corpse contamination, and then tzara'at, where a person is essentially considered a walking corpse. It's not inconsequential that those two things are tied together. Of course, there is some similarities there, but the idea of tzara'at from the sages' perspectives was that it was a spiritual condition. It's not necessarily a medical one. It would just manifest itself in a sort of physical nature, and be that a house, cloth, leather, or a person. It represents some sort of physical shortcoming, or a spiritual shortcoming or a spiritual defilement. And the sages often put it together with lashon hara, or evil speech, gossip, if you will. This sort of words that are destructive words. This using your tongue to destroy instead of build up, lashon hara. This is believed by the sages to be the primary cause of something like tzara'at. It's not necessarily to say that the person is a great sinner. Moses, had tzara'at temporarily. So did Miriam. There are instances in which we see lashon hara specifically being directly tied to the condition of tzara'at. And the sages, of course, also agree that tzara'at doesn't exist today. It only exists either in the land of Israel while the second temple is standing, or while a temple is standing, excuse me, or it can happen anywhere, but it only happens when there's a temple available. It is sort of a miraculous thing. Now, it seems like a bad thing, and in some ways it could be, but as we get into the next Torah portion, we're going to see that uniquely this condition is a miracle. It's a good thing. And we're going to get into next week why that is. So I'm just going to whet your palate for that. Stick around for next week's episode, how we talk about why tzara'at, how I talk about, this is my lesson next week, how I talk about why tzara'at is a good thing, a miraculous thing, and even something that would strangely be, not something that you would want, but things happen with the tzara'at that doesn't happen anywhere else. So with that hint, I'm going to leave you for the rest of the day. Thank you for joining us this week on the Waypoint podcast. If you enjoyed today's lesson, please consider liking the video, hitting the subscribe button if you haven't already, and ring the bell, of course, so you know precisely when these videos come out. We release them weekly, of course, for the portions. And with that being said, thank you very much once again for joining us here. We will see you next week. Shalom.